Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Permitted with Conditions, a podcast about zoning, land use, housing, and economic development. I'm David Toyer, president of Toyer Strategic Advisors, and your host again for today's episode of Permitted with Conditions. I've got with me a special guest, Lisa Lefeber. She's the CEO and executive director at the Port of Everett. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So there may be a few listeners that aren't too familiar with what all a port does, but can you kind of tell me a little bit about the port and its significance in this region and maybe how it's different than some other ports that are in the area?
Sure, absolutely. That's my favorite topic to talk about ports. There's a saying in the industry that once you've seen one port, you've seen one port. There's actually 75 ports in the state of Washington, and they mirror the economies in which they operate. Washington has a very unique port system because we also service the economic development arm for our areas. Prime example, if you go to California, they're part of their city or county. If you go to Georgia, they're part of their state. So ports across the nation look different than they do in Washington state. But in Washington state, our job is to create jobs through international trade, economic development measures in terms of infrastructure, transportation improvements, environmental enhancements, recreation, you name it, we can do it, broadband. We have a pretty wide authority. I think about the Port of Everett, we have 3 business lines. We have our international seaport. We're known in the international community as the Port of Boeing. We bring in all the oversized parts for the 777, 767, 777X, soon to be 737 MAX with the new line going in Everett, as well as all the military derivatives. We're also a big supporter of the US Navy and just recently got strategic seaport designation. So we're one of only 18 ports in the nation that within 48 hours can move military cargoes for mobilizations. So that's our international seaport. We differ from the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, which a lot of people are familiar with. They are our consumer ports of the region. So they bring in all the things that we use every day. We bring in the things that are oversized and high value, like airplane parts, like military cargo, electrical transformers to keep the lights on that serve the region, a variety of really cool stuff that doesn't fit into a standard container. And then on our, I guess the fun side of the waterfront, we have 2,300 marina slips. We have the largest public marina on the West Coast with 10 guest docks, a 13 launch boat lane, and a 1,500 acre island, Jetty Island. You're probably familiar with it. It's very busy right now. I'm looking at it. And then we have industrial development. So we've done numerous business parks over the years that we've leased them out and got the infrastructure ready to accept. And then we have a large environmental arm. We just got done opening up a new area, which I can talk about a little bit later. And then we've got a $1 billion mixed use redevelopment underway within Waterfront Place.
Let's talk a little bit about Waterfront Place, because I think that might be the most visible and obvious that a lot of folks see. Tell me a little bit about kind of what the port's been doing with Waterfront Place. And I know you've had some recent announcements with, I call them fun and cool things that add a lot of amenity to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely kind of the face of the port right now with all the effort going on. We're creating a destination waterfront for Snohomish County and the Everett waterfront. I like to say we're building on the 5 things that you can do in the Puget Sound, no matter what time of year, which is eat, drink, sleep, work, and play. And so that's kind of the areas that we're focused on. Recently, we just opened up 5 new restaurants and 3 new businesses: Fisherman Jack's, South Fork Bakery, Sound to Summit Brewing, Woods Coffee, and then the Muse, which is the historic Weyerhaeuser building, which doubles as a museum, but is also a whiskey coffee bar. So that's pretty cool. And then we have 2 boat brokers and Freedom Boat Club. So if you don't want to bring on another 1,000, you can use Freedom Boat Club and essentially have a subscription to use the boats when you want. And then we added in a new playground set down at Jetty Landing for kids to enjoy the park before they got on the ferry.
Yeah, it's been quite a change in just the last few years down there with both, how it appears as well as just being a hub of activity. And I know we've gone down, my wife and I, and experienced a few of the restaurants, and I'm a big fan of Woods Coffee too. Kind of building on that, you mentioned it, you've opened up a new estuary. It's, I think, another kind of one of these things the port does that maybe isn't so visible, that's super
Yeah.
critical and important, not only for port activities, but really for kind of economic development in the region. Maybe just walk through a little bit about what you've done with the estuary and maybe kind of the complexity of how that had to come together.
Yeah. So last year we opened what we call Blue Heron Slough, and it's a 353-acre wetland mitigation bank. It's something that the port has been working on since 1993, trying to identify how do we breach the dikes, how do we repair the estuary to its natural state to enhance the ecological value of the harbor, to bring in salmon and water birds, all the wildlife that makes the ecosystem work. And through an innovative partnership with the Tulalip tribes, US Navy, Geldwin, Weyerhaeuser, and the port, we were able to identify natural resource damages that actually helped fund this amazing project. And just last week, actually, got a report from the Tulalip tribes that 5 species of fish have been found in the estuary. And one of them being salmon and the other flounder, and then there was a couple of others. So it's doing its job. So from an environmental standpoint, you know, if you have the salmon and the fish, that helps our orcas. So it's all interconnected. It also serves very effectively as a flood management tool. When you restore the estuary back to its natural state, it can absorb quite a bit of the sediment and flooding that has happened on the river.
So with the new estuary, is there like habitat mitigation credits that are available then for your projects and other people's projects? And
yeah, it doubles. So it doubles as a environmental enhancement, but also as a tool to help promote economic development. So for example, if Washington State Department of Transportation or any of the cities or ferries or anybody who does water work, whether it's building a bridge or replacing a bridge or building a bulkhead, they can actually buy credits in the bank as opposed to doing on-site mitigation, which makes for a better environmental benefit by being able to buy those credits.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to kind of point out that I think a lot of folks may not understand is, you know, when you have new projects and you have potential impacts to critical areas and you have to mitigate, common form of mitigation, if you can't do it on site, is to buy off-site credits. And in fact, you know, as you know, the state and Army Corps of Engineers and other major agencies that are involved in the permitting process really prefer the off-site mitigation and these kind of comprehensive mitigation strategies that are well monitored and managed by professionals versus some of the on-site mitigation that tends to be smaller and might get turned over to an HOA and not necessarily professionally managed. And that, for at least issues that I track, is one of the things I'm following right now, because you've got a lot of jurisdictions going through critical areas ordinance updates. And I'm a little concerned about conflicts that will happen in the future with like even Snohomish County right now, where they're starting to indicate their preferences on-site mitigation and not off-site mitigation, which really runs counter to where everybody else in the permitting process is at. So hopefully that can get resolved favorably as these processes take place the rest of this year. But it has been a big push to really focus on these large, complex environmental benefits, and what the port's done with that in this case is really awesome.
Yeah, it's a great tool. Many people may not use it, but the folks that need to use it, it's there for them.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this in relationship to Waterfront Place, but as you're aware, not only as kind of an economic development agency in the region, but an employer yourself, housing is a real critical issue. And you've, as a part of Waterfront Place, have really made sure that housing was an integral part of that planning. What's been the port's kind of strategy behind housing and how it integrates it into some of these improvements, and how the port may see housing, you know, as kind of an ongoing thing that you focus on in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that's been talked about a lot recently. So housing and operating housing is one thing that is not in our authorities. We can't do housing, we can't do social service for homeless and things like that. However, housing is a key part to making other different elements successful. So, for example, if we were to do Waterfront Place, and only have office space, public access, and restaurants, retail, it wouldn't be successful. You need that housing, you need the people down here to enjoy it and to use it to make those types of mixed use projects work. So in our position, housing is a critical function to facilitate the overall success of the Waterfront Place development from that standpoint. Now, from an employer workforce recruitment standpoint, affordable housing, workforce housing, that's a critical piece to make sure that we can get the workforce close to where they work, as opposed to having to be really far away and then drive in. And as we know, our traffic is not wonderful around here.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that people may not understand is the Port of Everett's boundaries are pretty small, yet we've kind of got this regional industrial growth strategy that Puget Sound Regional Council has worked on over the years that focuses on, these industrial centers and manufacturing industrial centers. And so Payne Field, for example, where Boeing is and a bunch of other manufacturing companies, that's one of those designated centers. Arlington, Marysville area is one of those designated centers. And both of those happen to fall outside port boundaries. But as you mentioned earlier, with what you do for the large oversized cargo, you're really serving those industrial locations. I think it's important for everybody in Snohomish County to understand what kind of economic impact does the port have because of its, operations as it relates to kind of countywide activity.
No. So the Port of Everett, despite our boundary size, is a regional asset and really a national asset. I always tell people, we're the port that most people are connected to, because who hasn't flown on a Boeing aircraft? So we have a very strong and wide impact. We do anywhere between $21 and $29 billion a year in U.S. exports. We're very much an export port that's high value cargo. We support about 40,000 jobs in the region. Obviously, we're looking to, if that could grow, that's always our goal, is to grow more jobs. And then we contribute about $400 million plus back into the state and local taxes through our operations. So a pretty big economic footprint, but being the only global gateway for Snohomish County, we are the only entity that has a foreign trade zone capability. And with a lot of the things that are going on in the world, that's becoming more important to business, and we've gotten a lot of inquiries. And so trying to figure out how we can serve those areas outside the district, regardless of what happens with the boundary expansion, in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and let's talk maybe just a little bit about the boundary expansion, because I know it's coming up on August 6th for a vote. The port's looking to expand its boundaries beyond its current kind of footprint inside the city of Everett. And that would include really all of Snohomish County, with the exception of what is occupied by the Port of Edmonds. What are some of the benefits that other communities that may not view themselves as really having a relationship with the port, what are some of the benefits that those communities could expect being able to be inside the port and have really the port kind of promoting economic development and these other activities?
Yeah, so I think one of the things about ports I talked a little bit about earlier is that we're about economic prosperity and quality of life. So all of our lines of effort work towards creating jobs, enhancing recreation, improving transportation so people can get home to their families sooner and their kids' sports games. And then environmental stewardship is key, as we talked about. And so right now, all of our capital investment, we've invested about $185 million in capital in the last 5 years. That is pretty much limited to our existing boundaries. And as you know, Snohomish County looks a lot different than it did in 1918 when the port was formed. And so in 2018, the commission said, hey, let's ask the community and see if there's an interest in having port services offered in other parts of the county. Because right now, about 90% of the county does not have access to port resources.
Yeah, as you're aware, our firm was lucky enough, we got to work with a bunch of the industrial companies that went into the manufacturing industrial center in Arlington and Marysville. And you've got millions and millions of square feet of industrial space that it's going to be built. And we're seeing everything from Tesla out there to Amazon to others, and it's kind of span
all of our customers.
Yeah, it's going to
Yeah.
span so many different segments of the industrial marketplace and its jobs and stuff. You talked about transportation, and I think that's really important that you not only have the infrastructure at the port as it relates to the barge and truck, but you also have rail infrastructure that serves into the port. And so
Yeah.
just the connectivity and relationship between the port and even Arlington and Marysville, where you got rail lines that go out to that industrial park. You've got other ways to access some of these other assets in other communities. What are some of the ways the port could invest further in communities if they were a part of the port's boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the thing I get asked all the time is, what projects could you do? Or what projects are you going to do? And we don't have a project list right now because we don't have expanded boundaries in those areas, right? So that will follow. But with respect to rail transportation, one of the things that is unique to ports is that, as I mentioned earlier, ports look different throughout the nation. And so when you go to Department of Transportation as a port, depending on where you're at, it's elevated. It's moving freight, it's moving people in some cases. And we have special grant programs available just to ports for making improvements to freight. So with respect to grade crossings, I'll give an example in Monroe. Right now, and Marysville for that matter, we can only provide letters of support and advocacy for those projects. You know, if boundaries were to expand, we could potentially provide matching funds to their grant application or partner with them on helping with the construction or the advocacy and identifying, you have 17 grade crossings through the Cascade Industrial Center. Which ones do you need? Which ones do you not? Kind of looking at the whole district on how do you move freight through the Cascade Industrial Center more efficiently.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Monroe's case. I can just think about a couple of those at-grade crossings kind of on the boundaries of either side of their industrial area. I mean, one of them's right after you come into town, the other one's down by the hospital. And I mean, even from a public safety perspective, as it relates to serving industry, but also just serving the benefit of the public, I mean, if they were able to find new ways to deal with that, that'd be fantastic.
As we were doing our outreach, the number one comment that we heard for our East County was transportation infrastructure improvements, grade crossing eliminations, US 2 congestion relief, Highway 9 congestion relief, Highway 522 congestion relief. So really trying to put some high visibility and attention and dollars into those corridors.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because Highway 2 is still just one lane in many locations. Major safety concern as a highway because of the rate of accidents and everything that take place on that road on an annual basis.
Well, and the other challenge with US 2 is that it's not just US 2, and I would say East County. The challenge is that there is only really one true east-west connector between I-5 and East County, and that is US 2. The next one is 128th, and then you're, buzzing through neighborhoods, or 164th, and you're trying to cut over to Highway 9. And so what's really needed is advocacy for another east-west connector.
Yeah, or something that's more specific to being a freight corridor or a bypass that's for freight through some of the more congested areas. As you look at this potential for expansion, what are kind of the steps? And I kind of read a little bit about this, but it's not just like this single step. It's kind of like you have to have the vote to expand the boundaries, and then there's some other kind of things that have to happen outside of that. Could you maybe just explain that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, if the Port of Everett were created today, we wouldn't, because of the size of the county, we wouldn't be able to be anything other than countywide with 5 and 4-year terms. But because of this enlargement process, it's not countywide because of Edmonds. If the ballot measure were approved, the next general election, we would have to put on a governance structure vote. So we would be asking the community, do you want 3 commissioners or do you want 5 commissioners? And if you want 5 commissioners, do you want 3 districts and 2 at large, or 5 districts? And so that's the next step in terms of governance. And then there would be, obviously the commissioner re-elections that would follow.
Yeah, that's something I think that most people aren't necessarily understand that there's a lot of process associated with this just to be able to, put this into actual effect once you decide that that's the route you're going down. Well, I appreciate your time today and sharing, about the activities that the port's doing. Is there anything else that I might have missed that we didn't talk about as far as what the port's working on, or a little teaser for something upcoming that we might expect or be looking for at Waterfront Place?
Yeah, I think the Waterfront Place. So last week we broke ground on 2 new restaurant and retail buildings that will open up next summer. We'll be having Rustic Pork Wine Bar, Tapped Public House, Alexa Cafe, Menchie's, a fresh fish market, and we're working on securing a Mexican restaurant. So we will have significant more options on top of our already wonderful choices next summer.
That's awesome.
And then we do expect to break ground late next year on a 315 unit mixed use ground floor retail multifamily housing in Waterfront Place as well.
Awesome. That area down there, if anybody listening hasn't been down to Waterfront Place recently, just the vibe and the activity, especially on a nice day, it's just a fantastic addition to the community. It's a real amenity.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Permitted with Conditions. Be sure to subscribe to our Substack page or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where we also appear. Feel free to follow us on social media for updates in between episodes. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about today's discussion or any other topic. Until next time, we appreciate your listening.